I let my younger cousin stay with me after his divorce, and within 6 months he had quietly turned my house into his own, changed the way everyone in the family contacted me, and somehow convinced our relatives that I was the one invading his space. The first sign that I was losing control of my own house was when my aunt called my cousin before she called me. Not to ask if he was okay either, not to check how the move was going. She called him to ask what time I would be home, because apparently that was now the more reliable way to reach me. I remember standing in my kitchen staring at my phone when I saw his name light up on the screen, followed by my aunt's message a few seconds later. "Hey, just checking if you'll be around this evening. Your cousin said you might be busy." My cousin was standing 10 feet away in my living room, wearing my old sweatshirt, eating from one of my bowls, and pretending not to hear the notification chime. That was the moment I realized something had shifted, and I just hadn't been paying attention long enough to notice it happening. For context, my cousin Ethan had moved in with me after his divorce. He was younger than me by 4 years, and before all this, we'd always had a pretty easy relationship. Not close in the childhood best friends sense, but close enough that family gatherings weren't awkward, and we could sit in the same room without pretending not to know each other. He was the kind of guy who came off as decent, a little quiet, maybe a little too intense when he was stressed, but nothing that would make you think, this person is going to slowly take over my life. When he called me 2 days after the divorce was finalized, he sounded wrecked. He didn't do the dramatic thing people do in movies. No yelling, no crying, no long speech about betrayal. He just asked if he could stay with me for a little while until he figured things out. He said he didn't need anything fancy, just a couch, a roof, some time. I told him he could stay in the guest room. I genuinely thought I was helping family through a hard patch. That's it, that's the whole story, at least in the beginning. No hidden agenda, no suspicion, no dramatic warning bell. He had a bad year, I had an empty room, and I figured this would be temporary. The first week was almost pitifully normal. He arrived with 3 suitcases, 2 boxes, and a bag of random loose things that looked like he'd packed in a hurry and then repacked in a panic. He thanked me 5 different times the first night. He insisted on buying groceries. He said he'd keep to himself, that he didn't want to be a burden, that he'd be gone before I knew it. And for the first month, he mostly kept that promise. He worked odd hours, spent a lot of time on his laptop, and avoided making noise. He'd clean up after himself, wash his dishes immediately, and ask before using anything. He was polite in a way that almost made me feel bad for being relieved he wasn't more difficult. That's what makes these things dangerous, I think. Not the obvious disaster, but the slow proof that your guard was unnecessary. It makes you relax. It makes you believe the situation has already been defined. Then the little things started. At first it was tiny stuff I could dismiss. A mug would be in a different cabinet than I left it. My couch blanket would end up folded differently. My kitchen counter would have 1 extra item on it, like a charging cable or a pair of his earbuds, and I'd move them without thinking. Then his mail started arriving at my address, even though he swore he'd updated everything. Then he started leaving his shoes by the front door, in a way that made it feel less like he was visiting, and more like he was living there. I know that sounds stupid, but there's a difference between someone being a guest and someone starting to organize the space around themselves. One day you realize you've stopped asking where your things are, because you're subconsciously adjusting to theirs. 6 weeks in, he asked if he could put a shelf in the bathroom. I said sure. Then he asked if he could move his clothes into the larger closet in the guest room, because it made more sense for storage. I said sure. Then he asked if he could change the internet login, because his laptop kept dropping. I said sure, because I was trying to be generous, and because none of it seemed worth fighting over. That's the pattern, by the way. People don't usually start by asking for ownership. They start by asking for efficiency, convenience, practicality, something that sounds temporary and reasonable. By the time it stops sounding temporary, they've already changed the shape of the place. The first real crack in my patience came when I got home from work one day and found he had rearranged the entire living room. Not just casually moved a chair, I mean fully redesigned it. The armchair I usually sat in had been pushed into a corner, the coffee table was turned, the lamp had been relocated, even the rug had been shifted, so the whole room looked subtly wrong, like a memory of itself. He saw my face and immediately said, "I hope that's okay. I was just trying to make the space feel more open." I remember laughing, but not because it was funny. I said, "You could have asked." And he gave me this tired little smile, the kind people use when they want to make you feel irrational, without openly calling you irrational. "I thought you'd like it," he said. I didn't answer because I had no good reason not to like it besides the fact that it was my living room, and he had no business redesigning it without asking. But if you say that too sharply to someone in a vulnerable situation, suddenly you're the cold one, the uncaring one, the guy who's being difficult. while someone else is trying to rebuild their life. So I swallowed it. That was probably mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 was not noticing how quickly he became the center of the family conversation. It happened gradually. He'd stay in touch with relatives more often than I did, which at first seemed innocent. My mom would mention that Ethan had checked in on her. My aunt would say it was so sweet that he was keeping everyone updated. One of my uncles said he appreciated how open Ethan was during this hard time, how he never made people pry. That should have been weird, but instead it just made me look less attentive by comparison. If I forgot to reply to a family text, Ethan would already have answered. If someone asked how I was doing, he'd respond first. If they needed an address, a time, a phone number, he'd supply it faster than I would. And the first time I noticed that he was answering messages that were technically about me, I brushed it off because I didn't want to sound paranoid. But then the content started shifting. I'd get messages like, "Let Ethan know I'm coming by Saturday, even though the house was mine." Or, "Does he want his old room left alone?" Which was odd because there was no his old room, only the guest room he was using. Then the strangest one came from my aunt again. She asked if I'd made peace with the arrangement and if I was adjusting okay to sharing the space. Sharing the space. That sentence sat in my head for hours. Because I hadn't agreed to share anything, I had let him stay with me. Those are not the same thing. I asked him about it that evening, trying to keep my tone casual. "Why is everybody talking like you live here now?" He didn't even look surprised. He was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, half his face lit by the screen, looking calm in that annoying way only people with a secret can look calm. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. My aunt just asked if I was adjusting to sharing the space." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead like I was the one stressing him out. "Well, I do live here." I stared at him. "You're staying here, temporarily?" "Yes," he said, "and I'm living here temporarily." "That's not what I said." He looked at me for a second, then gave a little shrug. "It's still where I live right now." There was no aggression in his voice. That's what made it so irritating. He wasn't fighting me. He was calmly relabeling reality until the room itself sounded like it belonged to him. I told him to be careful about how he talked to family, because I didn't want people getting the wrong impression. He said, "I'm not trying to give anyone an impression." That would have been a perfectly normal sentence if he had said it like a normal person. But he said it like someone who absolutely was trying to create an impression and wanted to pretend the evidence was invisible. The weird part is that I still didn't think of him as manipulative at the time. I thought he was just emotionally needy after the divorce. I thought maybe he was overcompensating because he felt insecure. I thought a lot of generous things that, in hindsight, were really just different flavors of denial. Then came the first family dinner, where I genuinely felt like a visitor in my own home. My mom, 2 aunts, my uncle, and my cousin's ex-wife's sister, for reasons I still don't fully understand, all came over for a casual dinner that Ethan had helped coordinate. That phrase alone should have told me enough. He'd set the table, cooked half the meal, picked the drinks, and arranged everything in a way that made the house feel curated. Not messy, not even hostile, just organized around his presence. People kept asking him questions. How was he holding up? How was the move? How was the house search going? Yes, the house search. Because apparently Ethan had told at least 3 family members he was looking for a place nearby, and that I was letting him use the guest room until he got settled. Using the guest room. Not staying with me, not crashing while he got back on his feet. Using the guest room like I was the temporary support structure in his larger relocation plan. I tried to correct it once, gently, in front of my aunt. She said, "Well, I mean, he is staying with you, sweetheart." That's what I told them. And she smiled while saying it, which made me feel insane. Because I suddenly understood something ugly. Ethan had not just been living in my house. He had been narrating my house to the family in a way that made his presence sound natural and my ownership sound secondary. By the time I realized that, it was already starting to work. Relatives stopped asking me directly when they wanted to visit. They asked him. My cousin called him to tell him she was in town, even though I was the one she was close to. My uncle texted him to ask if things were okay there, as if Ethan were the one managing the situation. And the worst part was how smoothly he handled all of it. He never seemed eager, never seemed overtly power-hungry. He just accepted the role when it was handed to him and let everyone else fill in the blanks. When I started pushing back, I noticed another pattern. He'd act confused, then wounded, then reasonable. If I asked why he was answering for me, he'd say he was just being helpful. If I asked why he told family he was house hunting nearby, he'd say he didn't think that was a big deal. If I asked why people were treating him like the one in charge of the house, he'd say, I don't know, maybe because I'm the one here helping keep it together. That one landed hard, because there was always just enough truth in his words to make me hesitate. He was helping with bills. He was cooking more often than I did. He was around more than I was during the week, because my job kept me out longer. That was the genius of it, if you can call it that. He never needed to take the house from me in any legal sense. He only needed to become the person everyone associated with it. Once that happened, any complaint I made sounded petty. I became the guy who was upset that someone else had made himself useful. And that's where I'm going to stop this part, because the next piece is where it stopped being weird and started becoming personal. It stopped being funny the day I walked into my own kitchen and realized my cousin had started making decisions there without asking me. Not little decisions, real ones. He'd replaced the dish rack because the old one was too small. He'd bought different trash bags because the ones I used always tore. He'd moved the breakfast cereal into a new cabinet because it was more logical. Every change on its own was minor, almost annoyingly sensible. Put together, they felt like the first layer of a takeover. I didn't say anything at first, because every time I tried to confront him, he had the same calm expression that made me feel like I was overreacting before I'd even finished my sentence. But then I came home one Thursday and found a package on the porch with his name on it. It was a mailbox key set. Not a duplicate, a replacement. He was inside when I picked it up, and when I asked him what it was, he said, "Oh, I just figured I should have my own key for the mailbox since I'm here." I asked why he needed his own key. He said, because I live here. I remember staring at him for a long second, waiting for him to smile or admit he was joking. He didn't. That's when I started checking things more carefully. The first thing I noticed was that he had changed his address on a few accounts, or at least started using mine for deliveries. That alone was bad enough, but then I learned he had told my aunt he was planning to stay for the foreseeable future, which was the first time I'd heard any version of the arrangement that implied permanence. That night I asked him directly how long he thought he'd be staying. He answered, "Until I get back on my feet." I said, "That's not an answer." He looked at me, measured and mildly offended, and said, "It's the only one I have." Then he added, "I didn't think we were keeping a countdown." That sentence annoyed me more than it should have, because it was so carefully phrased. He never said I was wrong for asking. He just reframed the idea of asking into something impatient and unsympathetic. It made me feel like the bad guy for wanting a timeline in my own home. A week later, my mother came over to drop off some food, and ended up sitting at the kitchen table with Ethan for almost an hour while I was in the shower. When I came downstairs, she was laughing at something he'd said about the transition period. I asked her what transition period she meant. She looked genuinely confused for a second, then said, "Well, this is a lot for both of you, honey." Both of you. That was another one of those phrases that sounded harmless until I realized how much was packed inside it. It placed Ethan and me on equal footing, as if we were two roommates navigating a shared hardship, not one person letting another stay in his house. I tried to explain, casually at first, that I had never agreed to anything long-term. My mom frowned and said, "He told us you were okay with him settling in for now." For now? That phrase kept coming back from different directions, always vague enough to be deniable, always solid enough to be useful. It let him present a temporary arrangement as a soft fact that could keep stretching as long as no one challenged it too hard. And when I did challenge it, he acted hurt. Not dramatically, just enough. I told him later that evening that he needed to stop speaking for me to family. He leaned against the counter and said, "I wasn't speaking for you, I was just giving them context." Context makes it sound like you're the one hosting. He gave me a slow look and said, "Well, they're worried about me." There it was again, not a denial, a sidestep. Not "I didn't mean that," not "you're misunderstanding me," just a neat little pivot into his pain. He had learned something very quickly. If he positioned himself as fragile enough, my objections started sounding cruel. Around that time, he began taking over the visible rhythms of the house. He cooked dinner more often than I did. He stocked the fridge more consistently. He knew when the trash went out and remembered the recycling schedule. He kept track of small household things I didn't even think about anymore, and because he did them well, everyone started seeing him as the more responsible one. That should have been a relief. Instead, it was a problem. Because responsibility has a way of becoming authority when nobody is paying attention. One Saturday afternoon, my uncle called to ask if I wanted help with the place. I said, with what place? He laughed and said, with Ethan settling in, of course. I felt my stomach tighten. He's not settling in, he's staying with me temporarily. There was a pause on the line, then my uncle said, right, well, that's basically the same thing. No, it is, that was what I wanted to say. Instead, I just thanked him and ended the call, because I could already feel the conversation turning into one where I sounded defensive and stubborn over a technicality. But the technicality mattered. A temporary stay has boundaries, a settled-in presence has expectations. One implies movement toward leaving, the other invites everyone else to adjust around the current arrangement. Ethan understood that better than I did. He started making himself available to family in ways that made him look dependable. If an aunt needed a ride, he offered. If someone needed a phone charger, he had one. If my mother wanted help carrying something, he was already there. I noticed that people began thanking him for things that used to be part of my role in the family. He didn't take those moments with obvious greed. He just accepted them with a quiet nod that said he understood the value of being useful. And because he was useful, he started getting included in plans before I was. That part really bothered me. Not because I wanted to be the center of attention, but because I started hearing about things through him that I should have been hearing about directly. A cousin would text him about dinner plans, and he'd mention them casually to me like I was being filled in late. My mother would ask whether he was coming with us, even if the event had nothing to do with him originally. I remember one evening in particular when I was standing in the hallway putting on my coat, and he walked by and said, "Don't forget, your aunt wants us there by 6. Us? Not you, not she asked if you'd come. Us. I turned to him and said, "Why are you saying us like this is your house?" He didn't even flinch. "Because I'm leaving from here too." "That's not what I mean." He looked at me, genuinely puzzled in a way that was clearly performed, and said, "Then what do you mean?" The problem with that question is that it makes you sound insane if you answer it honestly. What did I mean? I meant that he had started talking like a permanent resident. I meant that he had folded himself into my life so slowly that everyone else had started treating him like the natural extension of me. I meant that I had gone from being the person helping a relative to being the obstacle he had to politely work around. But trying to explain that to someone who was already committed to misunderstanding you is exhausting. So I said, "I mean, stop acting like you're running the place." He gave a little sigh, like I was the difficult one, and said, "I'm just trying to make things easier." That phrase was becoming his shield. Easier for whom? Never specified. Easier in a general sense. Easier for the household. Easier for the family. Easier for everyone except the one person whose ownership was getting blurred in the process. The real turning point came when I found out he had been giving people directions to my house, as if he were the point of contact. My cousin texted me one night asking if she should ring the side gate or use the front code. I replied, "What side gate?" She sent back, "Ethan said that's how you usually want people to come in." I actually had to put my phone down and sit there for a minute, because I didn't even know how to respond to that. He had invented a preference for me. Not a huge one, just enough to sound normal. The side gate had never been part of the routine, but now, because he said it with confidence, my cousin assumed it was established household etiquette and not something he'd made up. When I brought it up, Ethan said he didn't see the problem. I was just trying to make it easier for people. I don't want you making house rules for me. He looked offended. It's not a house rule, it's just how we do things here. We? Again? I said there is no we when it comes to decisions I haven't made. He stared at me for a second, then said, "You're making this weird." That was the part that really got under my skin, not because it was clever, but because it was such a clean inversion. I was reacting to something real, and he was trying to make the reaction itself look like the problem. It worked with other people too, because from the outside I probably did look tense. I probably did sound overprotective. I was the one pushing back against a man who was going through a divorce, leaning on family, trying to rebuild his life. That context made him sympathetic and made me seem territorial. He knew that. I'm not saying he sat there plotting every move like some cartoon villain. I'm saying he understood which side of the story sounded compassionate and used it well. By the time I saw it clearly, he had already started shifting the emotional ownership of the house. He was the one family checked in on. He was the one who kept everyone updated. He was the one they worried about. I was the one who appeared stressed, short-tempered, or not handling it well. And that's where this part ends, because what came next was the first time I realized he wasn't just occupying my house. He was actively building a version of it that didn't include my authority at all. The moment I knew this had gone beyond a messy living arrangement was when my own mother asked me why I was making Ethan feel unwelcome. That hit harder than I expected, because it came from someone who knew exactly what the original arrangement had been. I had not been subtle about it. I had told my family from the beginning that Ethan was staying with me temporarily after the divorce. I had said it in plain English. I had repeated it enough times that I thought it was impossible for the message to get distorted. And yet somehow, over the course of a few months, the story had changed. Now, according to the family narrative, Ethan was the one trying to rebuild his life with dignity, and I was the one who had started resenting him for being around. That's the kind of thing that makes you question your own memory. Not because you suddenly believe the lie, but because you can't believe it's gotten that far without you noticing. I started paying closer attention after that. I watched how Ethan talked to people on the phone. I noticed the way he'd mention details I hadn't shared with him directly, then use them in conversation with relatives later. I started seeing how he'd casually bring up my habits in a joking way that made me sound overly rigid or difficult. Oh, he's picky about the thermostat. He likes the house quiet in the morning. He gets weird if people move things around. Each one was framed as a harmless quirk, but collectively, they painted me as the finicky homeowner who had become irritated by a poor divorced cousin just trying to coexist. That bothered me for two reasons. First, because it was false. Second, because it was strategically false. He wasn't saying things that would obviously turn people against me. He was creating a softened portrait of me, one that made my discomfort seem like an overreaction, rather than a response to being gradually edged out of my own space. That realization made me furious in a cold, controlled way. I stopped trying to hint at my frustrations and started asking direct questions. How long did he think he'd be staying? Why was he telling family he was settling in? Why was he answering for me when people asked about the house? Why had he changed the guest room setup without asking me first? Why was my mail being moved to a different basket? Why did it feel like every time I turned around, something in the house had been optimized around his preferences? He never reacted with anger. That was his other trick. If he had blown up, if he had yelled at me or tried to dominate the argument, then the situation would have become easier to categorize. Instead, he stayed calm and mildly disappointed, which made me look like the one bringing conflict into the home. I'm not trying to replace you, he said one evening when I confronted him about the way family was contacting him. That's not the point. What is the point then? The point is you're acting like this is your place. He sat there for a second, then said, I'm acting like someone who lives here. I hated how cleanly that sentence worked. Because yes, technically he did live there. That was the problem. The temporary arrangement had become the semantic shield he could hide behind. Any complaint I had sounded like a complaint about his existence rather than his behavior. Then I discovered he had done something that crossed into my personal life in a way I couldn't ignore. I came home one Friday and found a small stack of envelopes on the counter. At first I thought it was junk mail. Then I saw that one of them had been opened. It was addressed to me, and it had been resealed poorly with tape. I asked him about it immediately. He said he thought it was probably something important, and had opened it by mistake while sorting mail. By mistake, I repeated. He nodded once. I was organizing the counter. You opened my mail. I didn't read it like that. That line is always such a giveaway. The structure itself is an admission. People who don't think they've done something wrong usually defend the action, not the level of reading they applied to it. I asked him why he was sorting my mail at all. He said because it was piling up. I didn't ask you to sort it. I was trying to help. There it was again, help, the universal solvent. If he touched something, changed something, or reclassified something, it was always because he was helping, as if intention erased boundaries, as if overstepping could become kindness just because he sounded sincere while doing it. I checked the letter he'd opened and realized it was from the insurance company. Nothing dramatic, thankfully. But the fact that he had gone through my mail at all was enough to make me see the shape of the problem more clearly. He wasn't just becoming more comfortable. He was becoming more entitled. That was the difference. Comfort means you settle in and respect the structure that welcomed you. Entitlement means you begin treating the structure as if it exists to adapt to you. I made a mistake then, and I want to be honest about that. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I started talking to other family members, trying to figure out what version of the story they had been given. That probably sounds obvious, but I was still hoping it was some misunderstanding I could smooth out without creating a bigger fight. That approach backfired almost instantly. My aunt said she thought I had offered him the stability. My uncle said he assumed I'd told Ethan he could stay, as long as needed. My mother said she believed I was being supportive, but maybe getting tired of the arrangement. That last one strung, because she said it with genuine sympathy, as if I were burning out from generosity, rather than being slowly crowded out by a person who had learned how to look helpless while taking up more and more room. The worst part was realizing Ethan had not had to lie in a dramatic way. He just had to keep choosing phrasing that nudged people in the wrong direction. He never said I'd promised him the house. He just said things like, "I'm staying here for now, and we're figuring it out." He never said I wanted him to take over. He just told people I was stressed and needed space. He never said I didn't want him there. He just made it sound like my resistance was emotional rather than practical. That's what made it hard to challenge. Every individual statement could be defended, the pattern could not. And the pattern was this: the more he inserted himself, the more people treated him like the bridge between me and the family. He became the preferred point of contact because he was more responsive. He became the person relatives checked on because he was more emotionally available. He became the one they trusted to explain my moods because he was more pleasant to talk to. That's the kind of social drift that can happen so slowly you don't notice until you're already standing on the wrong side of it. Then, one Sunday, I had the first conversation that made me think he had been preparing for this much longer than I realized. I was in the garage looking for a tool when I found a box of old household documents tucked behind some paint cans. It had been moved from where I usually kept it. Inside were manuals, warranty papers, and a folder with copies of a few utility statements. Nothing unusual. Except one of the papers had a note clipped to it in Ethan's handwriting, with a list of account names and login reminders. Not my handwriting, not mine at all. He had been making an inventory. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't malicious in the cinematic sense. There was no evil laugh, no grand scheme scribbled on a wall. It was just a neatly written list of the logistical details of my house, organized like something he'd need if he were managing it long term. I stood there with that paper in my hand and felt this cold, heavy recognition in my chest. He wasn't improvising anymore. He was building a parallel structure. That night I asked him if he knew anything about the papers in the garage. He looked at them once and said, "Oh yeah, I was just putting things together so we'd have everything in one place." "We?" He paused just long enough for me to notice. Then he said, "Whoever needs access." That was it. That was the sentence that made me understand I was no longer arguing about a cousin's stay. I was arguing about whose reality would become official. And he had been doing it so quietly that by the time I felt the floor move, most of the family had already adjusted their weight to match his version. The next part is where I stopped trying to keep this peaceful. I stopped trying to be polite after that. Not in some dramatic, shouting match way. I just stopped smoothing everything over. I stopped laughing when he spoke for me. I stopped letting family members treat his version of the situation like it was the neutral one. And I stopped pretending I could fix this by being patient. The first real confrontation happened on a Wednesday night when my mother called to ask whether Ethan had decided where he was going next. That phrase told me everything. Not whether I had asked him to leave, not whether we had discussed next steps, whether he had decided. I asked her why that was suddenly his decision. She sounded surprised and said, "Well, he's been here a while, sweetheart. He's been here because I let him stay here. That doesn't mean he gets to decide the arrangement." There was a long pause, then she said carefully, "He says you've been making things tense." Of course he did. I told her flatly that if anybody was making things tense, it was the person telling the family I had no authority in my own house. She didn't like that. I could hear it in her silence, but for once I didn't backpedal. That same week I sat Ethan down and told him he needed to start making actual plans to move out. No whenever, no for now, no vague transition period. A real timeline. He didn't explode, he didn't storm off, he just looked disappointed, which was somehow worse. "I thought we were helping each other," he said. I almost laughed at that. "What exactly have you been helping me with?" He stared at me like I had insulted him. I've been around, I've been contributing, I've been taking care of things. By talking to my family like you're the one in charge. He looked down at the table for a second and said, I didn't think it was a big deal. That sentence again. It's amazing how often people use that line when they're perfectly aware something matters. They don't mean it isn't significant. They mean they hope you'll feel silly for treating it as significant. I told him it was a big deal because it was my house, my mail, my family, and my name that kept getting pushed out of the center of the story. He said, no one's pushing you out. I asked him then, point blank, if he understood why I was angry. He said he understood that I was stressed out. That was not an answer, and we both knew it. He had gotten very good at acknowledging my feelings in a way that never admitted his behavior caused them. That night, he agreed to start looking for a place. I should say, he agreed in the way people agree when they want the conversation to end. It wasn't a concession. It was a delay tactic wearing a polite face. In the days that followed, I noticed something new. He started acting injured around the family. Little comments, little sighs, little hints that he was being rushed before he was ready. Suddenly, I was the one creating pressure. I was the one who should have more compassion. He had gone from the wounded cousin to the embattled resident, whose mean relative was pushing him out before he'd had a chance to recover. And because my relatives had been hearing his version for months, a lot of them accepted that framing instantly. My aunt called to say maybe I should think about how hard a divorce is. My uncle said I might be expecting too much too fast. My mother said she wished I'd be a little gentler. None of them asked what gentler looked like after half a year of quietly being rewritten in your own home. I kept my mouth shut through most of that because I was waiting for the move out to happen before I blew everything up. Then I made one mistake that probably helped expose him. I told him I was going to be out of town for a weekend. I didn't mention that I'd be back early. When I came home Saturday afternoon, there was another person in my living room. Not a stranger, but one of Ethan's friends from out of state. They were sitting there with drinks, talking like they belonged there, music playing, shoes by the door, my kitchen occupied like a shared social space. And Ethan, when he saw me, had the nerve to look startled. That was the first time he'd made a mistake I could actually see. I asked him why someone else was in my house. He said, I thought you were gone until tomorrow. You thought wrong. He got embarrassed then, but only after he realized I wasn't going to let it slide. The friend apologized and left quickly, which made me realize Ethan had likely told them I was fine with it. Maybe not exactly lied, but close enough. Close enough to make his social life feel like an extension of the house he was borrowing from me. I asked him in private whether he had invited people over without asking. He said it was just one person. You don't get to decide that. He rubbed his face and said, you're making this way bigger than it needs to be. That was the breaking point for me. Not because of the visitor itself, but because he still did not seem to understand that this wasn't about a single incident. It was about a pattern of him converting permission into assumption. I told him very clearly that he had 2 weeks to move out. He looked shocked. Then he said, 2 weeks, that's not much time. You've had 6 months. He did the thing people do when they realize the room is no longer on their side. He got quiet, then said, I thought family helped family. I said, family doesn't take over someone else's life. That conversation should have ended things cleanly. It did not. Instead, he started leaning harder into the family narrative, and the family started leaning harder into his. For the first time, I saw what he had been doing not as a series of mistakes, but as a complete social strategy. He had made himself the emotionally legible one, the one everyone could sympathize with, the one everyone could text, the one who seemed adaptable, appreciative, and wounded. I was the inconvenient variable. And once people start seeing you that way, they stop asking what's fair. That's when they ask what's easiest. Part 4 of 5. I stopped trying to be polite after that. Not in some dramatic, shouting match way. I just stopped smoothing everything over. I stopped laughing when he spoke for me. I stopped letting family members treat his version of the situation like it was the neutral one. And I stopped pretending I could fix this by being patient. The first real confrontation happened on a Wednesday night when my mother called to ask whether Ethan had decided where he was going next. That phrase told me everything. Not whether I had asked him to leave, not whether we had discussed next steps, whether he had decided. I asked her why that was suddenly his decision. She sounded surprised and said, well, he's been here a while, sweetheart. He's been here because I let him stay here. that doesn't mean he gets to decide the arrangement. There was a long pause, then she said carefully, he says you've been making things tense. Of course he did. I told her flatly that if anybody was making things tense, it was the person telling the family I had no authority in my own house. She didn't like that. I could hear it in her silence, but for once I didn't backpedal. That same week I sat Ethan down and told him he needed to start making actual plans to move out. No whenever, no for now, no vague transition period. A real timeline. He didn't explode, he didn't storm off, he just looked disappointed, which was somehow worse. I thought we were helping each other, he said. I almost laughed at that. What exactly have you been helping me with? He stared at me like I had insulted him. I've been around, I've been contributing, I've been taking care of things. By talking to my family like you're the one in charge. He looked down at the table for a second and said, I didn't think it was a big deal. That sentence again. It's amazing how often people use that line when they're perfectly aware something matters. They don't mean it isn't significant. They mean they hope you'll feel silly for treating it as significant. I told him it was a big deal because it was my house, my mail, my family, and my name that kept getting pushed out of the center of the story. He said, no one's pushing you out. I asked him then, point blank, if he understood why I was angry. He said he understood that I was stressed out. That was not an answer, and we both knew it. He had gotten very good at acknowledging my feelings in a way that never admitted his behavior caused them. That night, he agreed to start looking for a place. I should say, he agreed in the way people agree when they want the conversation to end. It wasn't a concession. It was a delay tactic wearing a polite face. In the days that followed, I noticed something new. He started acting injured around the family. Little comments, little sighs, little hints that he was being rushed before he was ready. Suddenly, I was the one creating pressure. I was the one who should have more compassion. He had gone from the wounded cousin to the embattled resident, whose mean relative was pushing him out before he'd had a chance to recover. And because my relatives had been hearing his version for months, a lot of them accepted that framing instantly. My aunt called to say maybe I should think about how hard a divorce is. My uncle said I might be expecting too much too fast. My mother said she wished I'd be a little gentler. None of them asked what gentler looked like after half a year of quietly being rewritten in your own home. I kept my mouth shut through most of that because I was waiting for the move out to happen before I blew everything up. Then I made one mistake that probably helped expose him. I told him I was going to be out of town for a weekend. I didn't mention that I'd be back early. When I came home Saturday afternoon, there was another person in my living room. Not a stranger, but one of Ethan's friends from out of state. They were sitting there with drinks, talking like they belonged there, music playing, shoes by the door, my kitchen occupied like a shared social space. And Ethan, when he saw me, had the nerve to look startled. That was the first time he'd made a mistake I could actually see. I asked him why someone else was in my house. He said, I thought you were gone until tomorrow. You thought wrong. He got embarrassed then, but only after he realized I wasn't going to let it slide. The friend apologized and left quickly, which made me realize Ethan had likely told them I was fine with it. Maybe not exactly lied, but close enough. Close enough to make his social life feel like an extension of the house he was borrowing from me. I asked him in private whether he had invited people over without asking. He said it was just one person. You don't get to decide that. He rubbed his face and said, you're making this way bigger than it needs to be. That was the breaking point for me. Not because of the visitor itself, but because he still did not seem to understand that this wasn't about a single incident. It was about a pattern of him converting permission into assumption. I told him very clearly that he had 2 weeks to move out. He looked shocked. Then he said, 2 weeks, that's not much time. You've had 6 months. He did the thing people do when they realize the room is no longer on their side. He got quiet, then said, I thought family helped family. I said, family doesn't take over someone else's life. That conversation should have ended things cleanly. It did not. Instead, he started leaning harder into the family narrative, and the family started leaning harder into his. For the first time, I saw what he had been doing not as a series of mistakes, but as a complete social strategy. He had made himself the emotionally legible one, the one everyone could sympathize with, the one everyone could text, the one who seemed adaptable, appreciative, and wounded. I was the inconvenient variable. And once people start seeing you that way, they stop asking what's fair. That's when they ask what's easiest. Part 5 of 5. The last month was ugly. Not loud ugly, worse, quietly ugly. Ethan acted like he was leaving while doing everything possible to make leaving look unreasonable. He talked about job applications, apartment listings, and waiting on a response like he was doing all the right things. But every update was vague enough that nothing could be verified. He was always almost there, almost ready, almost about to have a solution. Meanwhile, the family kept drifting into his version of events. My aunt asked if I was still pressuring him. My uncle said maybe I should let things breathe. My mother told me she hoped I wasn't taking out my frustration from work on him. That one made me laugh out loud, which was probably the first honest reaction I'd had in weeks. He was no longer just living in my house. He was now an emotional project everyone felt invested in, and I was the obstacle standing in the way of a clean ending. I started counting the days. Not because I expected him to honor the timeline, but because I needed proof that I hadn't imagined the pace of this takeover. I kept a list of incidents, messages, and little phrases he'd used with relatives. Every we where there should have been an I, every here where there should have been a his place. Every time he answered for me without hesitation. The list got long enough that it stopped looking like a dispute and started looking like a record. A few days before the deadline, I had one final conversation with him in the kitchen. I asked if he had found anywhere yet. He said, "I'm looking." I asked for a date. He said, "Soon." I told him soon wasn't enough. Then he finally did something honest. He got irritated. Not furious, not explosive, just openly annoyed in a way he'd avoided until then. He said I was acting like he had tried to steal something from me. I said, "You did try to take over my house." He scoffed and said, "That is not what happened." I looked at him and realized there was no middle ground left. He genuinely believed that if he made himself indispensable long enough, the house would become shared by default. He thought familiarity plus contribution plus family sympathy would eventually equal ownership in practice, if not on paper. I told him he had been changing how people saw my home for months. He said I was trying to make things easier for everyone. For everyone except me. He didn't answer that. And that silence mattered more than any defense he could have offered. 2 days later, one of my cousins texted me asking whether Ethan was definitely moving, or whether I had changed my mind. That was the moment I knew he had been telling people I might back down. I sent a message to the family group chat, something I should have done much earlier, and said plainly that Ethan had been staying with me temporarily, that I had asked him to make arrangements to leave, and that no one should assume he was speaking for me about the house or my schedule. No insult, no drama, just facts. The response was immediate. Some people were surprised, some were awkward. One aunt tried to smooth it over by saying maybe everyone had misunderstood the situation. Ethan did not respond in the chat at all. He came to me later that night and said I'd embarrassed him. I asked him if he had any idea how embarrassing it was to have your own family treated like a guest in your own home. He stood there for a second, then said quietly, "I didn't think it got that bad." That was the closest he ever came to admitting the truth. He moved out a week later. Not cleanly, not gracefully. There were still boxes left behind, a missing charger and 2 kitchen items I never saw again, but he left. And after he was gone, the house felt bizarrely empty, not because I missed his company, but because I could suddenly hear how much of my life had been arranged around avoiding conflict with him. The strangest part was what happened afterward. The family didn't exactly apologize. Most of them just shifted into a newer, quieter version of the story, one where everyone had been confused, and nobody had meant anything by it. That's how people protect themselves from realizing they were played. They convert manipulation into misunderstanding. I didn't argue, I didn't need to. What mattered was that my house was mine again, and the story attached to it had stopped being his to narrate. That's the part that stayed with me the most. Not the mess, not the frustration, not even the social weirdness. It was how easily a person can step into your life under the banner of need, then slowly train everyone around you to treat your boundaries like an inconvenience. He never kicked down the door. He just learned how to walk through it so often that people forgot whose house it was. That was the whole trick. And once I saw it clearly, I never let anything like it happen again.